You wouldn't remember.
A reproductive rights issue.
Yes, back when Lynn was running the reproductive rights program at ACLU.
Exactly. Oh, I'm so honored you remember it. I certainly do.
Okay, we are ready. We're live streaming, so we're gonna go live now on Zoom.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I hope everyone is staying safe and dry and are able to join us in this important conversation. I am Jocelyn Bowling-Dixon, Director of Newark Public Library, and I will briefly introduce our panelists so we can start our discussion. Just a reminder, this program is part of our Keeping It Real series, and the conversation is about race, gender, and class, and it's sponsored by the Philip Roth Endowment. So first off, I'll start with Mr. Jonathan Capehart. Jonathan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Jonathan was born and raised in Newark and is a graduate of St. Benedict's Preparatory School. Capehart is a Washington Post editorial board member, hosts the Cape Up podcast, serves as anchor of the Sunday Show with Jonathan Capehart on MSNBC, and is a regular contributor on PBS NewsHour. Ms. Laura Marsh. Laura Marsh is the literary editor of The New Republic and co-host of Politics of Everything podcast. She has written for the New York Review of Books, Book Forum, and Dissent. We also have Ms. Loretta Ross. Loretta Ross is an award-winning, nationally recognized expert on racism, racial justice, women's rights, and human rights. Her work emphasizes the intersectionality of social justice issues and how it can fuel transformation. Ross is a visiting associate professor at Smith College and has co-written 3 books on reproductive justice. And finally, we have Nadine Strassen. Nadine is a New York Law School professor emerita. Excuse me if I dice anyone's name. Please pardon me. Nadine Strassen is also a past national president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008, and is a frequent speaker, media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties, who has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. Her most recent book is Hate: Why We Should All Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So thank you all for joining us once again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. My name is Nadine Strassen, and I am the supervising librarian of the Philip Roth Personal Library at the Newark Public Library. I want to express my sincere gratitude to our moderator and all of our panelists. I'm thrilled and very appreciative that they were all able to participate, and I look forward to listening and understanding more about this topic that we've been hearing so much about. I'd also like to thank Celeste Bateman for facilitating, to Miriam Jaff for her recommendations, and to Ingrid Betancourt for her advice and guidance, and to all my colleagues for their help. At any point during the presentation, I encourage you to post comments or questions, whether you're watching live on Facebook or on Zoom. After about a 45-minute discussion, we'll move on to a question and answer session, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. And right now, it's my honor to turn this over to Jonathan Capehart.
Nadine, thank you very much. Jocelyn, thank you very much. It's nice to be back at the Newark Public Library. We've all been introduced, so we can jump right on in to the conversation. And I think we should start by just defining in our own terms, or I should say in your own terms, I'm just the moderator, what cancel culture is. And let me start with you, Nadine. When you hear the phrase cancel culture, what does it mean to you? How do you define it?
It's a little bit paradoxical, Jonathan, because on the one hand, it consists completely of an exercise of free speech rights, various people protesting, denouncing, objecting to various ideas or expression that they disagree with, and advocating some kind of action, usually punitive action, against the person who has made the offending statement. So that is literally an exercise of First Amendment rights. When other people join in the advocacy of the cancellation, they are exercising their freedom of association as well as freedom of speech. And yet, the impact of cancellation is to suppress speech, not only by the person who is subject to typically very punitive action, including losing a job, losing friends, losing publication opportunities in the case of students who have been admitted to colleges and universities, having those admissions retracted. Not only are they severely punished for exercising their free speech right to say something that other people consider objectionable, but the overarching impact is what lawyers call a chilling effect on free speech. Public opinion survey after survey shows that substantial majorities of the public all across the ideological spectrum are not daring to address critically important subjects because they are sensitive, in particular race and gender, and they are so afraid of being canceled. So it's an exercise of free speech, but paradoxically, it suppresses free speech.
So then, Laura Marsh, your definition of how do you define cancel culture?
I certainly don't have a definition as eloquent or developed as Nadine's. It's a term I tend to avoid using because I feel that the social movements of the last 5 years, particularly, which have brought sexual misconduct and racism into the public conversation more and more, have tended to call for consequences for long-standing patterns of behavior that we've always known are unacceptable, and in many cases have just simply gone unpunished, and in some cases glorified. But I think when people use the term cancel culture, what they're referring to is kind of a mass expression of anything from disappointment and dismay to outrage at a statement or maybe an action that someone has taken, and a desire for there to be some kind of consequences.
And Loretta, how would you define the phrase?
Well, I'm probably going to sound heretical, but I think some things should be canceled. I actually think racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and all of those expressions should be canceled. They are not healthy for a democratic society. But cancel is actually the big brother of calling out, where you not only object to what somebody has said or something they have done, but you want the ultimate punishment, kind of like a prison industrial punishment. You want them punished, you want them exiled, deplatformed, you want them to suffer as the person who's doing the calling out and canceling imagines that they should suffer. But at the same time, we can't take cancel culture off the menu because there are things in our society that absolutely should be canceled. And it's not just a matter of free speech. If free speech was harmless, we would be able to use it and abuse it in the ways that we are seeing it used and abused. The famous thing of fire in a theater kind of analogy. And so I agree largely with what has been said before, but as a human rights activist, I believe that it's time to do a reset on what we understand as free speech, because what people seem to be demanding is consequence-free free speech. They want the right to say whatever they want to say, and they don't want to pay the price for having said it. And let's be clear, there's no such thing as a free lunch or even free speech without consequences.
Well, I agree with most of what you said, Loretta, and I completely agree that it is an exercise of free speech, including to advocate punishing somebody. But, you know, I'm so thrilled to meet you again on a different issue from the last time we crossed paths, because I have read about your advocacy and exercise of calling in rather than calling out. Sure, we have the right to call out. We have the right to cancel. And in some cases, that may be the most effective strategy. But what I love from what I've read about your approach is that it recognizes that given the challenge of combating racist attitudes and hateful and discriminatory and other attitudes that we would like to see change, we have to ask, what is the most effective strategy? And often cancellation or calling out is counterproductive. It doesn't do anything to redeem that person. So that's why I try to separate what you have a right to do versus what is effective. And of course, that will change in every particular situation.
Laura, did you want to jump in there?
I guess I have a question, which is, when do we locate cancel culture as becoming a phenomenon? Like, I feel like it's important to talk about the context in which people started using this term cancel culture, which I think sprang up about 3-4 years ago.
Right.
When, especially with the Me Too movement, you start seeing consequences for actually actions rather than statements. It's very rare that we're seeing consequences for someone making a sexist statement, but when people are talking about instances of sexual assault or sexual harassment that no one had really cared about before, then you start seeing consequences. And I think that to an observer, those consequences suddenly look really shocking because there's like a lot of them happening all at once. And this seems like a frightening new phenomenon that needs a new name. And so I think it's important to get a sense of whether that, when we're talking about cancel culture, are we talking about a dynamic that's always existed, or are we talking about a dynamic that we've seen more in the last few years? And I'm curious, I guess, to get the other two panelists' views on that. Like, what do you think the scope is?
Loretta?
Well, America is the ultimate cancel culture. I mean, ask the indigenous people what we did to them. I mean, really? So it's a bit hypocritical to claim now that we are free or that we just recently are witnessing this phenomenon. Matter of fact, I believe there was a guy called Alexander Hamilton who was called out and killed in a duel. So all of these things have always existed. What is different now is the virality of social media, that you can now summon a mob so quickly, and that there is no due process. There is no real investigation of whether or not the allegations are true or not. And then there's a specter of guilt by association, so that if you even come up in defense of someone who is called out or canceled, then certainly you must be guilty of the same impropriety or accusation that they've been accused of. But Nadine, you talk about calling in, and that's something I'm a big proponent of, because obviously when you call people out or call for their cancellation, you just invited them to a fight, because you publicly humiliated them, you've shamed them, you've accused them of things, and there's no process for them to establish their guilt or innocence. And so that's why I prefer to seek accountability by calling them in, inviting them to a conversation. Like if I discover somebody tweeted something horrible in the past, instead of jumping down their throats, I'm going to ask them, what was going on with you back then when you put this out there? And what's going on with you now? Do you still think the same thing? We can pursue accountability better, and I agree with Nadine, and more effectively with love, respect rather than anger, blame, and shame. Anger, blame, and shame will thwart us in achieving accountability, because no one wants to run and confess that they've messed up if they're gonna face a judgmental Twitter mob by doing so. And so we need to grow up in many ways as a society and individually.
I agree with both of you. Obviously, Laura, there is the pendulum had swung so far against any kind of due process, to use the concept that Loretta raised, for victims who were subject to all kinds of discriminatory and harassing behavior. But as often happens, the pendulum swung too far, in the sense that we now have the problems that Loretta talks about, of people who have merely said something that some people find offensive. They've not engaged in any kind of bullying behavior, and you may disagree with their ideas, but you may think their ideas are obnoxious, but you're not likely to dissuade them if you treat them like a criminal. Jonathan wrote something, he did a podcast a couple of years ago that was, to me, just one of the most dramatic examples that I don't think is nearly as well known as it should be. This was on his Cape Up podcast, a part of the series called Voices of the Movement, about the civil rights movement. And the main person he was interviewing was Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California, but hearkening back to when she was a student, a college student, volunteering for Shirley Chisholm's campaign for president, the first African-American woman to run for president in a major party. And Barbara Lee, as Jonathan recounts through these amazing interviews, was very upset because Shirley Chisholm wanted to suspend her campaign in the California primary to go to Alabama, to the bedside of arch segregationist Governor George Wallace, who had been shot 5 times and was paralyzed. And Barbara Lee was saying, how could you do this? This was the guy who famously campaigned on segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He's the opposite of everything you stand for. And basically, Shirley Chisholm said he's a human being. This could happen. This should not happen to anybody. And Jonathan interviews Wallace's daughter, who was at the hospital bedside. And I can't do justice through my paraphrase. I highly recommend that you read it.
You're doing very well.
Well, you just see Wallace being so moved by this more than gesture, her reaching out. And it transformed him. I had not realized, I don't think many people realize that the last time he ran for governor in 1982, he got 90% of the Black vote in Alabama. He appointed a record number of Black office holders. He presented the first, Black homecoming queen at the University of Alabama. I mean, it's just unbelievable transformation, and he got forgiveness from the Dexter Memorial Martin Luther King Church. And Barbara Lee said that she really learned from Shirley Chisholm, you have to have the courage to see the humanity, the potential humanity in everybody, and don't give up and reach out. I'm just so thrilled by that.
So what was so spectacular about that, when I first heard that story, it was a year earlier at the Civil Rights Pilgrimage, and I was moderating a panel called Children of the Movement, and it was Peggy Wallace Kennedy, Barbara Lee was in the audience, and Peggy told the story, and we were at Dexter Avenue Memorial Baptist Church, King's former church, and she told the story about how after her father got shot, and he had been, no longer governor, recuperating, he came to the church unannounced and wheeled down the center of the church to the front, unannounced, and asked forgiveness. And then when he left, the choir sang Amazing Grace. And so what I love about that story, and we've seen many stories like that in our history, of people who have done or said bad things and have gone on in their lives to redeem themselves, to show redemption, to not just say, I'm sorry, but to act on what they've done. Loretta, you said something in the beginning of this conversation in terms of defining for yourself what cancel culture is. And you said something that leapt out at me, because I agree with you 100% that there are people out there who want to exercise their free speech, but they want consequence-free free speech. And that to me is why I chafe at the phrase cancel culture, because it's to get to Laura's part about sort of the history of this. Yeah, it's been certainly within the Trump years being this right-wing talking point, that if you try to hold someone accountable, if you try to hold the then president accountable or anyone in his administration accountable for what they've said or what they were doing, that you are trying to cancel them. And so the question is, and I would love to hear it from all of you, why should people feel like they should be able to say whatever they want without getting feedback, without suffering the consequences of some of the things they've said or done?
Well, the problem that I have with most redemption narratives is that it doesn't address power imbalances. For example, I mean, I'm a rape and incest survivor. I, ran the first rape crisis center in this country. And there's always this narrative now coming up about people who have been harmed being urged to offer forgiveness to the harm doers. But that doesn't even address the power imbalances that are going on. The way after, the Mother Emanuel church shooting down in South Carolina, and the parishioners and the victims were, urged to forgive the person who killed 9 people. Why is forgiveness always placed as the burden of the person being harmed, as opposed to atonement being placed on the person doing the harm? It's like our society really expects people to be better and rise above the harm without, by the way, not with any reconciliation or reparations of the harm, but let's just rush to forgiveness so that we can create this redemption narrative, usually for white people, that benefits white people or men,
Yeah.
while the people are left bleeding raw and still in trauma. And so I really understand that we should give everybody the room to change, just like someone gave us the room to change. I've deprogrammed people in the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazi movement. I see their humanity. And so I'm never going to not see their humanity, because like Brian Stevenson said, everyone's better than the worst thing they've ever done. But at the same time, we just can't rush to this forgiveness narrative, this redemption narrative, without accountability. So George Wallace, for example, to use that example, I admire what Shirley Chisholm did. I hope that we're all strong enough to do that. But at the same time, George Wallace's story of personal redemption didn't address the structural racism of Alabama that he put into place. And I'm like, really? I want you to become a better human being, but I also want to see not only evidence that you individually are trying to make a difference, but what movement are you going to lead that's going to make a difference? Because you led a segregationist movement. Where's your anti-segregationist movement that you're going to lead to try to repair the harm that you've done? Because personal apologies, making these representational appointments, all of those things are band-aids on a system that has yet to unearth itself from genocide and white supremacy. So I'm a little skeptical of the quick rush to redemption narratives. And I think that we should be applauded for how generous, how magnanimous our hearts are. Because, we have to forgive people as an act of reclaiming our own dignity. Forgiving people isn't what you do for the other person, it's what you do for yourself, so that their dirty fingerprints don't determine your destiny. But beyond that, where's the reparation for the harm? Where's the platform? What are you going to do differently, not as an individual, but to change the structures that allowed not only your harm to take place, but what is America going to do that allowed Trump to be elected in the first place, for example? I mean, we need to look at the bigger pictures.
Nadine, I saw you raise your hand.
Well, I was going to thank Loretta, because essentially what you are saying is the message of a religious holiday that I and many other Jews are celebrating right now. The days of awe right now, we're in Rosh Hashanah, which is New Year, but it's usually described as new beginnings, but it leads into Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And that's what it's all about. You do not get forgiveness from some outside force. You pledge yourself to redeem your way of life, your deeds, moving forward in order to justify your continued inscription in the book of life, to be the best person that you can be, to contribute to the best and most just society for everybody. So, and I assume that other religions have very similar themes, but getting beyond religion, it's the theme of a movement that I'm so happy has gained traction in the recent past all across the ideological spectrum, so-called restorative justice, right? Even for people who have committed horrific, violent crimes. And it's not just that these people are forgiven, right? They have to earn the restoration into to be integrated into our community and our society. And I often am frustrated by a disconnect between some people who are very supportive of the restorative justice concept for other kinds of crimes, but not when it comes to the infraction of saying something that is deemed to be insensitive or offensive.
Go ahead, Laura.
I think something that's really interesting is to think about the free speech of groups of victims or survivors. Because often I think what we've seen on social media is groups of people who've had an experience, say sexism is one. They've experienced sexism and they've never really had the chance to talk as a group about how that manifests itself, the kinds of behavior that they've witnessed or experienced, and the effects that it's had on their ability to work or do other really important things in their lives. And without those kinds of conversations, you can't really even begin to register what the harms are that would be atoned for or that you would be able to forgive, because you haven't even had the space to know what is it that we're forgiving, what is it that we've experienced as a group. And I just give sexism as an example because that's something that I think we saw a lot of people sharing, like in the Me Too movement, like the whole concept of that hashtag Me Too was people saying, oh, this happened to me as well. And maybe you haven't had an explicit experience of like sexual assault, but you've had another experience that, you know, other women can relate to. And this should be addressed if we want to build a more just society and more equal society. I think one of the things I find really difficult about this idea of cancel culture is that often the speech of those groups of survivors or victims or just people who have an affinity is stigmatized, because them complaining in public or like sharing their experiences in public is seen as them being an angry mob who are trying to get people canceled for that behavior. And often it's not. Often it's people genuinely talking to each other about what they've experienced and how to address it. And I think that's something I've never really seen considered fully in these conversations, is like, how do you give people the space to talk about what they've experienced and actually name the thing that's happened to them?
But the problem, Lauren, and I totally agree with everything you say, but I've been in the anti-violence movement for 50 years. And the problem is that a victim-centered lens gives you the truth of their lived experiences, but it's a terrible place to view what should be done, because everything gets filtered through that trauma-informed lens. And so that's why people rush to punishment, rush to judgment, rush to disposability. It really is only part of the story. We were the first movement, of course, to say we need to believe survivors, but we also understand as survivors that the truth we think we've experienced, that we have experienced, isn't the entire truth. It's often not the entire truth. And so we have to use our best efforts to make sure that we create containers where multiple truths can be held, so that because when you do it from that victim trauma lens, you really tilt towards cancellation, punishment, dismissal. You start looking like a new prison industrial complex. And that is not as radical or transformative. And by the way, it won't even help the survivors. And that's very frustrating for me.
I agree with everything you've said about that. I guess what I'm referring to is the way that, especially people on the right or people who fundamentally oppose these movements on their principle, try to silence those initial conversations.
Of course, the people who
Um,
commit harm don't want it talked about. That's
Right.
basically the human condition. They want to suppress. They want to keep it from being discussed. The first thing they do is deny it. The second thing they do is attack the credibility of the person who's accusing of that. And then under Trump, they just, choose a different set of facts they want to believe in. So there's a
Right.
real logical progression to how that goes.
But Laura, finish your thought.
I think that was
Oh,
it.
that was it?
I
Okay.
guess the thought is kind of like, how do you make sure that those people have the space to actually talk to each other and kind of get their experience on the record so that it's recognized without confusing them with people who are trying to like ruin the lives, maybe even disproportionately of the people that they have suffered at the hands of.
Well, Nadine, go ahead.
It's a term that is used and abused in infinite number of ways. I think it really has taken on a stigmatizing context, because I think those who are fundamentally opposed to the movements for racial justice and gender justice have run away with attacking so-called cancel culture. So maybe we should try to come up with a better terminology. It reminds me of several decades ago, the term political correctness, right? And it applies to an infinite array of concepts, some of which are positive and some of which are negative, and the devil is in the details. And a key concept is what you just referred to, Laura, of proportionality versus disproportionality, or Loretta referred to earlier, due process. So maybe we should just try to reject the term or explain how inaccurate it is.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Loretta.
I don't know if searching for new language is the solution, because we're dealing with people who do what they do because of who they are, not because of what we say or do. They're going to do what they do. Whatever term we came up with, they're going to co-opt it, they're going to bastardize it, they're going to misinterpret it, and we could be searching all over for that new word and stuff. But I think what Lauren and Nadine, y'all are talking about is the lack of accurate threat assessment. When someone says a racist or an offensive joke, that is all of those things, but is it actually to be treated as if it was a death threat? The fact that everything is conflated now, all harm is seen as out of proportion. There is not a proportionate response to it. And I understand that our social mores are rapidly evolving and nobody can keep up. I think Lily Tomlin once said that no matter how cynical I become, I can't keep up. But this is what we're dealing with. But at the same time, I'm counseling those of us who believe in human rights to stop risking our credibility by not being proportionate in our response.
Is society, I mean, are we as a society, particularly one that seems to be ruled by social media and things going viral and things happening, at this faster than the speed of sound, are we capable?
Well, I'm old enough to remember when people thought the telephone was going to be the worst thing that happened to society. Back when we had party lines and you couldn't say anything about a neighbor without the operator or somebody else overhearing it. So I don't want to accuse the tool of being the problem when it's actually just plain old human behavior, human emotions, and things like that.
I mean, It's so interesting that we tend to emphasize the negative. I gather that's part of human nature and our basic psychology. And in the media, the old saying is, when it bleeds, it leads. I'm sure with the exception of the distinguished journalists who are here today. But I think too often people forget or take for granted the enormous positive movements that I don't think could have gotten off the ground without social media, including Black Lives Matter and Me Too and Time's Up.
No, that is true. So I want to bring up a phrase, excuse me, that Loretta mentioned earlier, and that I only learned earlier this year in reading Robin DiAngelo's second book, Nice Racism, where she kept writing this phrase, calling in. I was called in about this, and I sent her an email asking, wait a minute, are you using calling in as another way of calling out? Please explain this to me. And I think, Loretta, you explained it very well, but I just wonder, in this age that we are in, where everyone is either seemingly afraid to be canceled or are looking to cancel someone, do we have the bandwidth? Are we ready to move to that next concept, Loretta, of calling in people? Because if you're going to call people in, that requires, either a sense of mutual trust of some sort, where you can actually have a rational conversation. Or am I being too rational, too Spock-like in my interpretation of that phrase?
No, the phrase calling in was actually invented by an 18-year-old named Lone Tran. So I don't want to take responsibility or ownership for something I didn't create. It was out of the mouth of the young people that I heard what we needed to do. But the first step of calling people in is that interior assessment. Make sure that you're in a healed enough space so that you can create that container for other people's points of view, other people's emotions, other people's lived experiences. So if you're not in that space where you can tolerate hearing a different point of view that may contradict your own, then you're not ready to do a calling in, but anybody can do it. I mean, my favorite calling in sentence is, that's an interesting point of view. Tell me more. Very few people resist an invitation to tell you more.
Oh, wait, well, but Loretta, yeah. Okay, so you say, that's a very interesting thing. Tell me more. At what point do you lower the hammer, lower the boom, and say, that was racist, that was sexist, that was homophobic or transphobic, and here's why?
But see, the point is, is that until you establish that you respect them as a human being, everything you say about what they say is not going to be heard anyway. Because they're going to shut down the minute you start calling them names. Every human being does that. And so you have to create that conversational lane to even have those harder conversations with. But if you fail to see them, if you flatten them out to what you think is racist, transphobic, homophobic, and you start attaching that label to them, why in the world would they listen to you? It'll never happen.
Nadine, I saw you raise your hand.
My book, which was kindly mentioned in the introduction, is called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And it's really a very pragmatic concern. Yes, I'm concerned about free speech principles, but not in the abstract, but because I am absolutely convinced that freedom of speech, including empathetic listening and drawing out the other person, is the only effective way to redeem somebody or to help them redeem themselves from racist and other discriminatory attitudes. I'm not a social psychologist, but I read reams of social psychology and other kinds of experts about, and then a lot of testimonials from formers, as they call themselves, and people who were involved in redeeming them. And there's a thread that runs through all of it, which Loretta already talked about. You have to treat the person with respect and with empathy, not respecting their ideas, but respecting them as a human being. You cannot lecture at them. You cannot preach to them. You have to draw them out. And I'm convinced that the way to get over at least individual attitudes of racism and other kinds of isms and problems is that way. Now, I agree with a very important point that Loretta made. We have to go beyond individual change of heart and mind and attitude and shore up everybody's activism in a larger way. But you have to start by getting them to change their minds. And you don't do it. You certainly don't do it by treating them as criminals, as happens in other countries. And you don't do it by stigmatizing and ostracizing and shaming them either.
Laura, does what Nadine just said, do you think that that approach would work in the realm of sexism and Me Too? Like when you have, as you've been talking about, lots of people gathering together, certainly on social media, to talk about their experiences of either sexual assault or sexual violence, would Nadine's approach even work in the realm that you've been talking about?
It's an approach that obviously has worked in many areas on individual bases. For instance, Loretta talked about de-radicalizing people, deprogramming them. That's like incredibly difficult and brave work. And I think when it works, it's an unalloyed good. But I think if you look at someone like Harvey Weinstein, how would someone have deprogrammed him? Like, he had so much power and a whole system built around him to protect him. I use him as an example just because it's one everyone knows and it's pretty clear, but it's certainly not an isolated case. I think that trying to have frank and genuine conversations with people that you disagree with is always the right thing to do. But I'm a little skeptical that it can change behavior when there are so many incentives toward bad behavior, and especially if you're talking about something like patriarchy. If there's a culture in which everyone talks about who, you know, like the looks of the women at work, right? Who are the sexy women at work, and just objectifying all their female co-workers, I don't think I would make any headway like having these one-to-one conversations with men, because that's not how behavior and cultural norms are set. They're set by a climate of opinion. And I think it's very hard to change that kind of climate of opinion on a one-on-one basis.
Well, it's an and. It's not only one-on-one. I mean, I taught Black feminist theory to Black men who have been incarcerated for raping and murdering Black women. And so it can be done, but it also has to be done with structural changes too, with appropriate, proportionate punishments for bad behaviors. Because right now, anybody on anybody's payroll right now can blow up their whole organization with the keyboard. And so there has to be structural change as well as individual change. It's not all one way or the other, but many times our structures, our institutions are run by individuals, that we have to figure out a pathway towards helping them change, or leaving them inviolable means that they're going to just continue to be protected and continue to commit the harm. And the situation doesn't get any better. And I really counsel people to stop demonizing people simply because they have celebrity power and authority. You can't just treat people like they're a representation only of your worst fears. That means you've lost sight of their humanity as well, and you lose sight of the opportunities to get them to change when they are representational instead of human representatives of humanity.
We are getting close to the time when we open this up to Q&A, but I do want to give you each an opportunity to give some final thoughts in terms of our conversation. And I'm just wondering if there's a recent example in the news that you would like to comment on that's related to this conversation, related to, and I keep putting up quotes, cancel culture. For me, it's the story today out of Richmond, Virginia, and the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue to the Confederacy from Richmond, Virginia, which a lot of people viewed, the removal of Confederate statues as part of this cancel culture movement, whereas I look at that as, one, folks being held accountable, and two, removing things that shouldn't be on public display to begin with. So to my mind, some people might call that cancel culture. I call that accountability. But Laura, I'll start with you. If there's anything that's been in the news that you wanted to comment on that's related to what we've been talking about.
I don't have a recent example from the news, but I think your example is a really good one, because I think it's a really clear example of the term cancel culture being misused. It's Robert E. Lee is dead. He can't be canceled, but the true history of his life can certainly be told and has no place being glorified in public.
Nadine?
The first example that occurs to me, Jonathan, because I want to fight back against the opportunistic misuse of the accusation of cancel culture, which certainly has its excesses, but I think too many on the right who don't really care about free speech that much are happy to throw the term around. So here's a really good example why the same people on the right canceling all kinds of free speech and academic freedom in many states. And that's the raft of laws that have been passed and proposed in various states that outlaw the teaching of critical race theory or other so-called divisive subjects. What is more canceling than that? Denying freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry and freedom of thought and discussion to every teacher and student in the state. So it is a problem. We see these excesses on both sides of the ideological spectrum. We should speak out against the excesses whenever they occur from any point on the political spectrum, but also remember the positive points that Laura in particular brought out.
And Loretta?
There are so many examples, I can't even keep up. I mean, I could talk about how a lot of social justice organizations are imploding from within, not to mention like the Human Rights Campaign, what's happening with Planned Parenthood, what's happening in Texas. I mean, the Black AIDS Institute. There are so many organizations that are dealing with call out cancel culture within, and I'm talking about on the left at this point. And of course, the hypocrisy of the right, because they are doing everything they can to cancel, for example, Liz Cheney for daring to speak the truth about January 6th, and trying to cancel the telecom companies so that, in case they don't want those records to come out. And so I don't want to do a false equivalence, like the right is as bad as the left or the left is as bad as the right. There is one side that really does misuse and historically has misused the levers of power to not only cancel people's speech, but cancel people's lives. And let's be clear about that harm as well. And so I don't know if I could choose any one incident, but I will say what they all have in common is that when someone feels that they've been harmed by speech, instead of going after the context that created that harm, they usually go after the person who's closest to them, who's proximate to them. So on a big Zoom call the other day, it got Zoom bombed by a racist that called a Black woman the N-word, and everybody got mad at the organization that hosted the call instead of at the racist that called the Black woman the N-word. Or when the swastika was painted on my campus, everybody got mad at the president for what they thought was her tepid response instead of at the anti-Semites who painted the swastika. So that misdirection, that targeting of the anger, just because you choose to pick on or attack the people who you know will not fight back, will not hurt you, is something that we need to examine.
I mean, that is a great point. You went beyond where I thought you were going to go, because this question came in the middle of our conversation, and it's really good. And it has to do with someone who was in the news. And so I'll read it. It's a question from Ingrid Betancourt. And she writes, Colin Kaepernick was brutally canceled for kneeling during the national anthem at NFL games in protest of police brutality and racial inequality. Was that an appropriate exercise of cancel culture? Free speech? Which? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, Black people have never had the right to free speech the same that white people enjoy. Let's be clear. Again, when you try to ignore power relationships and the history of white supremacy in this country, Colin Kaepernick's free speech rights were not even entertained as a real thing by the people calling on him to be canceled and fired from the NFL. And the NFL, by the way, has yet to rehire him, while they have a lot more mediocre quarterbacks that they are giving jobs to. And so let's be clear, you cannot have a conversation about any of these topics and ignore race, power, gender identity, dynamics that affect who is afforded freedoms and who are denied freedoms, simply for the exact same behavior.
That there's a fundamental point of free speech law here, which most people are not aware of, which is that, I'm sorry, I wish it weren't true, but as a factual matter, neither Colin Kaepernick nor any other NFL players or NFL employees have any free speech rights. And that's true for all of us when we're working for private sector entities. So that's a problem that the ACLU long has crusaded. There should be basic legislative protection for employee free speech rights, the way we had to pass a civil rights statute to make sure equal protection guarantees applied in the private sector workplace. That's an overarching problem. I think there's a real hypocrisy here on the part of conservatives who very cheerfully said, oh, what the NFL has its own free speech rights and property rights, and it doesn't have to honor free speech rights of its players. But now when liberal-minded corporations are, canceling speakers with more conservative points of view, those very same conservatives are suddenly saying, oh, there should be free speech, for conservative viewpoints in other corporations.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me chuckle just watching the hypocrisy. Laura, did you want to weigh in?
I really agree with Nadine. A few years ago, I read an amazing book called Private Government by Elizabeth Anderson, which is about how corporations essentially operate as small countries with their own sets of laws, in which the laws of the United States don't apply, because your First Amendment right to free speech doesn't exist if you've had to sign an employment contract with a waiver saying that you won't disparage the company, you won't disclose anything about your experience.
What was the name of that book again?
It's called Private Government.
Private Government. Sorry, I'm doing reporting as we do this panel.
Research.
Right. This is another question. It's not directed at anyone. So if anyone feels moved, I'll call on you if I see you react. This question is, many people argue that banning Donald Trump from social media platforms was censorship / cancel culture at its worst. What do you make of that? Nadine, I'll go to you on this.
Well, I'm on the record as saying, of course, the social media companies as private sector communications companies not only have no obligation to respect other people's free speech rights, they have their own free speech rights. As editors, they can decide that they don't want any particular person or any particular message to be on their platform. So as a matter of law, they had the right to do it. As a matter of trying to create a free speech culture, I am very nervous. This statement that the ACLU put out, I think, was exactly right. You know, Donald Trump can find other platforms. He's powerful, he's rich, he's got connections, but we are really concerned about especially our Black, brown, LGBTQ clients who depend on this, you know, cheap, accessible medium. They're not going to have alternatives. And the fact that we have these powerful, completely unaccountable private sector entities that can decide who's on or who's off, what message is on and what's off. I don't think as many people are aware of it. Conservatives do a much better job of complaining that they're being censored from social media. But Black Lives Matter activists, pipeline protesters, other social justice advocates are regularly kicked off social media with no recourse at all. And that's a very serious problem.
What do you think, Loretta?
Well, I think that first of all, social media platforms, as you say, they're private companies. I mean, the New York Times doesn't have an obligation to print something I say or want just because I want them to do so. Those are private companies. And they have that obligation, but they also are functioning pretty much as a public utility, even though they're not seen as that, because they are so granularly intrusive into our lives that Facebook knows what I want to eat before I do. I mean, let's also acknowledge that. But I think the comparison between Black Lives Matter and Donald Trump is one of those false conflations. Donald Trump had a platform that caused a lot of harm, led to a lot of deaths, continues to cause harm. Only the most rabid racists would say that about Black Lives Matter. And so we can't, and so that's where the Facebooks, the Twitters, the Googles get it wrong. They're not looking at power differentials, the ability to cause harm. They're treating it as if Donald Trump's free speech rights are the same as Loretta Ross's or something. By the way, I teach a course at Smith called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump, and Facebook banned me from advertising the course because it had the phrase white supremacy in that. So their algorithms are supposed to be neutral, but they're messed up because they aren't living in the real world of who has the right to do to equate me with a QAnon person because I use the phrase white supremacy, trying to teach people how to fight white supremacy. They need to do better. And I know that's not for lack of money or resources, it's a lack of political will and sophistication.
Loretta, were you able to appeal that decision?
Yes, I had my staff appeal it and it got restored, but that was
still,
a lot of labor hours on my staff's part that they shouldn't have had to expend because, again, there's no accurate threat assessment taking place in this process.
Laura, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree that it needs to be, when we're thinking about who's speaking and how much power they have, there needs to be a nuanced assessment of the threat. I guess I just don't want Twitter and Facebook and other big tech companies to be the people who are arbiters of that. I think that's the issue at the heart of all this. And I think it's really a monopoly power issue. Private companies should not be able to acquire the power to become something like a public utility. If it reaches that point, it should either be regulated in the way that a public utility is or broken up. And so I think that's where this discussion becomes more interesting than just talking about cancel culture and free speech. Like, let's talk about the economic basis for those mechanisms of speech. Let's talk about platforms that are too big and too powerful, and beyond banning people or allowing them to stay on a platform, are mediating our speech in dozens of ways that we don't even know about, because Facebook's algorithm is a black box. When I post something on Facebook with my opinion, I don't know who's getting to see it. I don't know why they're getting to see it. But what I do know is that it doesn't have the same status as other people's posts or as an ad, because Facebook is choosing to show you some things and not show you other things. But that's a much more complicated conversation than I was canceled. Just means like I was ignored and no one knew. So I think we need a much, much better infrastructure for speech if we're going to talk about who gets to speak and how they get to speak.
Nadine, in the time that we have, this question is directed to you.
Oh.
And the person writes, I was wondering if Professor Strossen could give a few concrete examples of people who were improperly canceled in the last few years, and a few examples of people she might feel were properly canceled.
Oh, that's so interesting. As a professor, I would say, and somebody who frequently speaks on the campus lecture circuit, I'm most concerned about young people who made mistakes when they were even younger and had social media posts that were, racist or sexist. Certainly no message that I approve of. And yet I didn't think that warranted their having their admissions to college being retracted. One particular example that comes to mind is a young man, I'm not going to remember his name. He was one of the graduates of the school in Florida that recently had a terrible school shooting and spoke out against gun violence, became a really prominent nationwide activist against gun violence. Thank you so much. And yet many years earlier, when he was, an adolescent, he had a post on Twitter or something. He probably was drunk and said something very offensive and very discriminatory. He profusely apologized for it. He sought to atone Loretta. He volunteered with anti-racist organizations. He pledged to continue doing anti-racism work, and yet Harvard just had an absolutely unforgiving attitude and would not give him the opportunity to matriculate there. That to me epitomizes the worst form of cancellation. A good concrete example. The examples that Laura gave were people who had engaged in horrific behavior as well as expression. I think I would not personally give up, especially I've been inspired by Loretta and her talking about teaching feminism to men who've been convicted of rape. I think I wouldn't want to give up on anybody, certainly just or solely because of something they said. I say solely because I don't want to trivialize it. What you can say can be extremely distressing and traumatizing and cause psychic harm. But rather than therefore treating you as a non-person or imprisoning you, ostracizing you, I would like to try to intervene to change your attitude. So I can't think of a concrete example that's positive of that type. And maybe one of you, I sometimes say to myself, well, what about Hitler? Would he have been an exception? It's a tough question, speaking as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
Laura.
I do want to jump in there because I agree with Nadine. No one should be given up on. So I'm not in favor of a version of cancel culture that says once someone has committed an offense, that's it. Like they're never allowed to be part of public life again. They have no role in society, should be shunned. I think that's awful. All I'm arguing is that there has to be some mechanism for recognition that the behavior or a pattern of behavior, usually, I think it shouldn't be a one-off thing, that wasn't okay. Just recognition, not even necessarily consequences, like it has to be proportional, but without recognition, it's sort of meaningless, right? But then you don't have accountability. So I think ultimately the ideal is what you're talking about, intervention, like stop this happening before it happens, and reconciliation. But there has to be some kind of recognition, however you get there, in order to achieve those goals.
Loretta, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I think that I agree with both Nadine and Laura. I think the problem we have is that we have a culture of not only unforgivability, but unforgettability. So if you've ever done anything that you regret in the past, anybody can use it as a gotcha grenade on you because you can't be forgiven and it will never be forgotten. And that's what we have to get past because, again, it doesn't allow people to change. It doesn't even embrace a growth mindset. It's everything is fixed in time. And that's all that there is. At the same time, what does accountability look like? Because I'm participating in an entire movement that opens nearly every meeting with land acknowledgments around Native Americans, but I'm not seeing any land being given back to the Native Americans. I'm not seeing any scholarships at these colleges being opened up for the indigenous students who don't have chances to go to college. So at some point, accountability feels very performative to me, as opposed to really substantive and creating a difference in the lives of the people who are suffering intergenerational harm. But Laura has a good point. We spent 50 years first creating the concept that violence against women was wrong. And at first we thought maybe if we just told our stories more, that we could create a change. But slowly it's dawned on me is that it's not a matter that we're not believed, like at the Kavanaugh hearing, is that the people who had the power didn't care. And that's a different problem.
This conversation has been so spectacular. It went in so many directions. I hope the Newark Public Library puts out a transcript of this conversation because I will go back and mine it for so many great thoughts. Loretta, Ross, Nadine Strassen, Laura Marsh, thank you all very, very much for this really, truly fantastic conversation.
Thanks to all of you, including you, Jonathan.
Thank you again to everyone, particularly to our moderator and to our panelists, but also to our audience for listening so carefully and offering such wonderful questions. It's been an absolute treat to have Jonathan Capehart, Laura Marsh, Loretta Ross, and Nadine Strassen here with us today. And please stay tuned. The next program in our Keeping It Real series will take place on November 16th. That is a symposium called Conflicts Depicting Race and Ethnicity in Fiction, 1962 and 2021, Philip Roth, Ralph Ellison, and Pietro Di Donato. And following that, we'll be organizing a program on Jewish African-American relations, and that will likely take place next year. Again, thank you for joining us. This program will be available for viewing at any time afterwards on Facebook, and we'll post it on YouTube later on. So please spread the word to your friends, family, and colleagues. And to find out more about programs that we're offering at the Newark Public Library, please visit our website at npl.org. Thank you for your support, and please stay safe. Have a very good night. Thank you all.